Have the Gen Z youth all become far-right extremists? Go into the internet these days to platforms like Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, even YouTube, and you will notice that people have gone a bit crazy, especially the young people. Things are being said that would have been considered pariah opinions only 5 years ago. But is there any reality to this? Is this an echo chamber, a small group of very loud people on the internet, or is it some type of passing trend that no one really takes seriously? Well, I take a look at some statistics in order to figure out what is the case. And oh boy, things are definitely getting a little bit interesting. So within the Gen Z Zoomer youth, the older factions between the ages of 21 and 28 are bifurcating or splitting into hard right young males and hard left young females. That is something that we actually know quite well. But recent studies from only in the last couple of months, coming from universities like Yale, have actually begun to study the people younger than 21. And what they're seeing is a pretty extreme right-wing political shift in the youth under 21. The young males are just off the plantation. They've gone crazy. They're very, very hard right. And even the young females are beginning to start to nudge into the right-wing territory. But this is mere politics slop. This could be anything from people liking Trump or people in America liking Republican people, or maybe the right-wingers in America have gotten good at propaganda online. Is there any other trends that can give weight to this assertion? And it turns out there is. The Zoomers are the first generation in over 100 years to demonstrate that they are becoming more religious than the previous generation that came before them. Each generation, from the boomers to the Gen Xers to the millennials, has been more atheist, has believed less, until it arrived to us millennials and we became the most atheist, the most woke, the most liberal, the most open-minded, the most 1960s civil rights community that has ever lived. Our generation was the peak of these values. The Zoomers have broke that trend. They are more religious than us, and an awful lot of these trends only kicked into gear in the 2020s. Around 2022 is when a lot of Zoomers began to say that they believe in God. They're not like those cringe millennials or Gen Xers or boomers of the past who celebrate their atheism. Instead, they are going in a different direction. So the old idea that young people always become liberal, become atheist, become more left-leaning in their youth, this is getting challenged by the Zoomers. The Zoomers are going in the opposite direction. They are affirming right-wing beliefs. They are becoming more nationalist, it seems, and they are becoming more religious, not more atheist. So where all this goes remains to be seen. The first piece of evidence I'd like to show you is in regards to the Zoomer personality. It is quite clear that the Zoomer personality is significantly changing as a consequence of phone usage. This comes from a study by a man called John Byrne Murdoch, who showed us that in the younger demographics, trait conscientiousness is in free fall. It is basically dropping. Conscientiousness is your ability to be disciplined, your ability to endure and push through pain in order to get things done. Trait neuroticism is skyrocketing, going very, very high, particularly in the younger cohorts. If you're to be agreeable, an agreeable person basically is someone who, is easy to get along with if you so will, and maybe they're a little bit too compliant, might be an issue. The Zoomers are not agreeable. The Zoomers are all online, hardcore, disagreeable Reddit or X users, everybody very negative on the internet. It's very easy to be negative behind a phone when there's no consequences. It seems like trait agreeableness is becoming very extreme. They're becoming more disagreeable and their extroversion is going down. Now, these all indicate, obviously, that this is their dopamine receptors from TikTok absolutely frying their brains and leading to a destitution of the generation. Now, us older generations can, of course, make fun of the Zoomers for this, can use this to dismiss them as irrelevant, saying you're defected and you're diseased, you're an orc, you're an online gremlin, why should we listen to you? But this is, of course, a very irresponsible thing to do because we created the world that they exist in. We should be, helping our brethren, our younger, the youth, the future. We should be securing the future for them. But instead, no, we have abandoned them. And then we gaslight them when they complain about it. We call them diseased. We call them incels. We say there's all sorts of problems with those Zoomer retards that we don't have to deal with because our lives turned out well because we had conscientiousness. We had all these personality things that kept us in shape. And of course, this betrayal the Zoomers feel from the older generations leans into the next couple of pillars. The Zoomers have all become far-right extremists. They are all politically radical. You look at the memes that they're sharing, you talk to them about the type of media they consume, and these guys have gone hard. They are going hard, they're going right, and they have no tolerance anymore for the nonsense that is the political over and back and bickering between these older generations. It just seems stuffy and false. Everything that they are told is taboo, they are willing to embrace because they just don't like the way the world is now. And this is even being reflected in statistics. Like, for example, Pew Research here, it's showing this huge partisan swing in the last 2 years. Between 2023 and 2025, 18 to 29-year-old men have gone 44 points for the American Republicans. The women, even the women between the ages of 18 and 29, the young women have even drifted 14 points to the right. There is something big happening in the youth. You will see if you look at this study that it's actually the boomers, the people over the age of 65. They're the only people who are really holding out and, leaning more towards the left. All the younger generations are trending towards the right-wing direction. Excellent news, yeah? They are all based. The based chuds have arrived. You're seeing many videos and pieces of content and media like this, which is very honest but anecdotal experience of the change in the youth. This is a girl from England.
We were talking to some young boys over there a moment ago, and they really surprised me because they said they were into Reform UK.
Yeah, that's what everyone's been saying. Everyone around Chai has been saying that they're like Reform UK, they're very into it. I haven't really heard many people talking about Labour. It's mainly just been Reform UK, like people, like 15, 16 and everything, just been talking
That will surprise many people.
Yeah.
That's kind of strange, because most people think Reform voters, older, homeowners, blokes in their 50s and 60s, just saying it's kids in Chichester. Sorry, kids, young adults in Chichester.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of people that are just, if you ask anyone around here, like 15, 16, maybe even young, they'll all just say like it's all about Reform UK. They don't really have an opinion on like Conservatives or Labour, or it's just,
Well, this is what happens when you abuse the younger generations, when you look down upon them, you call them stupid, you make them defective, you transform their country in a way that they don't understand and then gaslight them for this. You create a monster. Now among the youth, they have turned into a beast. They are bowing out of the political system and they're literally saying we want things to get crazier around here because we just don't think there's any other way out. Oh dear, maybe you don't like that, maybe you do, who knows? But it seems like this is what is happening. A thunderous earthquake is now beginning to shuttle underneath the foundations of the future. But you could fairly dismiss this as partisan slop, Reform UK. You could say, Pew Research talking about Trump and republicanism. This isn't anything serious. This is just silly, conservative politics. They had a little bit of a high time there, but it's nothing that is that real. It's not a true fundamental value shift. Well, lo and behold, these things are happening from other perspectives as well. Take, for example, the religious angle. God is making a comeback as Generation Z is far less likely to be atheists than parents and grandparents. I'll go into this extensively throughout this video because I actually think it is the most fascinating aspect of this. But we are seeing an enormous change in the Gen Z youth. And this is obviously being triggered, and actually they often say this, by the change in personality they are experiencing. So they are experiencing much more neuroticism. They're becoming much more anxious and much more spiritually damaged. They're more lonely, they're more addicted to their phones. They've got dopamine problems, I'd imagine. And this is causing a mental health crisis. Now, in response to mental health crises, like Carl Jung would say, you try to fix your head. You try to make your head better. So Zoomers are trying to do that by going back to spirituality. Now, an awful lot of Catholic crusaders and stuff like this, Christian crusaders, will celebrate and say, this is the based church coming back. When I talk about this, I get a lot of idiots that say, it's just the immigrants. The immigrants are coming in and they are changing, making religion come back because they're all Muslims and they're all Christians from the Philippines or something like this. But this is not. People need to read statistics before they have opinions. This is not being driven by immigration. This is happening within the native white youth specifically. And it is even more nuanced than that, because this is not leading to a rise in church attendance. Church attendance and that old boomer institution of leaving your house and going out and doing stuff like that, that's actually not really getting that much better. Maybe some of the Catholic stuff is rising a little bit, but the real macro trend that's going on here, and we'll look into some of these stats, is that the TikTok algorithm and phones are showing that Zoomers are engaging in spiritual practices through their phone. They're listening to spiritual influencers. If you're a Catholic, if you're a pagan, if you're a Wiccan, if you're a Protestant, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Jew, if you're some sort of vague New Age believer of some sort, the Zoomers are choosing to go that direction. So they're rejecting. What are they rejecting? Atheism. They're rejecting this idea that Richard Dawkins says that the universe is a dead, Sam Harris says that the universe is a dead, empty, lifeless machine. They are pushing that away and saying, no, I believe there is a logos, a higher power, a reality, a spirituality to this universe. They're affirming that. But then the way they choose to do this can be almost any denomination. It's like Protestantism. And then the way they practice this is not by going to church or to temple or to the mosque. They're going on their phone. They're looking up things like spirituality, following influencers, and then using things like prayer apps, meditation apps, and things like this in order to engage with it. You actually see this in, for example, the European pagan movement. It's going through a huge revival right now, and loads of people are getting back into it. And the way they're doing it is through the internet, and they make lovely Instagram accounts that celebrate the beauty of European nature, and then they create these little aesthetic altars, and they do all this stuff where they'll do little prayers and stuff like this. And it's an online phenomenon where they're doing it for this little subgroup on the internet and practicing it this way. But it is also it seems like it's a sincere practice. They're dedicating essentially their entire lives to this. So atheism is going down, Christianity, paganism, Mormonism, it's all going up at the same time. And it's happening through the vector of the phone. It is the age of Aquarius. A techno-spirituality is clicking into gear. And of course, what's bizarre is that the reason why this might be so stimulative in the Zoomers is because of how technology is wounding them, making them depressed, making them isolated, and changing their personalities to make them more neurotic. Oh, fucking dear, what does this mean? And the last foundation here is that how all of these things are gathering together into one transformative perspective. You're seeing a reformation in religious ideals. Every generation since the boomers has been more and more atheist. Us millennials, we were the most atheist. And then the trend is shifting. This is a break you're seeing in the Zoomers. Every generation since the boomers was more left-wing, more liberal, more obsessed about civil rights and racial equality. And us millennials during the woke movement were the most anti-racist of any generation that's ever existed in all of human time, I'd imagine. And of course, the Zoomers are now breaking with all this. They're going towards the right. They're breaking with this idea of being more liberal. And there's this huge macro transition happening. The boomers were very much people who lived in reality. They are not techno people. The old boomers from the 60s went out into the world and went for walks and stuff like that. The Zoomers are the first generation to be entirely on their phones. Even me as a millennial, I didn't have the internet until I was older. I remember going out into the bushes and stuff like this, and this preserved me perhaps from being defected and destroyed by my phone. But the Zoomers never had that chance. They have been plugged in since the very, very beginning of their youth, in the age of 10, I'd imagine. And this is having an enormous effect. So the macro perspective from all of this is showing us that a huge transformation is happening, perhaps as significant as the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which went on to define the next 60 years of culture. Is this about to happen with the Zoomers? This is what we will explore today in depth. Now, I know I'm throwing out all these numbers, so the way I'm going to structure the rest of what we're going to talk about is I'm going to go through the boomer world order and the cultural revolution that has taken place since the 1960s, because that's one pretty big trend, and how the boomers set up the way the world has worked since the 1960s. They've set the moral values, the political values. They set the trends, like every generation being more liberal, if you so will, and how this has been handed down to us millennials, and we've become the stars of the boomers. We were the most liberal, most civil rights generation in history, and then how the Zoomers have come in and really shocked us with new political values, breaking taboos, online memes that break all these taboos, and how this has had an effect. And then we will look at the broader and larger trend that has been happening concurrently, is the 200-year process of the death of God that Nietzsche announced, the gradual atheism that has gone through a escalation in every generation, where every generation has been more and more atheist since the 19th century. And what might it mean now that it seems like that trend could be coming to an end? The Zoomers could break rank. So let's first go into the cultural phenomenon, the boomer world order and the civil rights regime that has been in place for the last 60 years, and how the Zoomers are turning their back on it. Now, I'm a bit of an old troon, but I will show up and I will talk to Zoomers sometimes, and I will, discuss with them, and we will talk about Nietzsche. And we'll all say to ourselves, we're going through a bit of a Nietzschean reevaluation in our values. We're learning how to be based once again. We're learning how to be chuds and to ignore all those wokies, all those idiot wokies that are holding us back from being Nietzschean Ubermensch chads. And what is funny is that the boomers themselves went through a Nietzschean reevaluation of their values. In fact, they often said it on these terms. Jim Morrison from The Doors, one of the famous rock and roll stars who created the concept of being a rock and roll frontman, he was the darling of the 60s and he was an avid Nietzschean. He loved Nietzsche, read Nietzsche, and often modelled a lot of his thinking on Nietzsche. And they all believed, like Jim Morrison, that they were destroying the conservative Christian culture that was holding back the liberalisation of the world. Now, you should know this, but a lot of people don't know this, is that the reason why we call them the baby boomers is because they were the children of those who came back from World War II. There was an explosion, a baby boom, because after you win a war, you get very rowdy, you want to celebrate. And so they were an enormous generation. Still to this day, they are a massive generation, and a lot of problems are going to come from this. I'll do this in a later video. And in the 1960s, they were all hitting teenager years and early 20s. And it was during the 1960s that a huge amount of radical pillars were put into place that fundamentally shifted the way culture was going to go. Because, of course, you have the conservative Christian America who won during World War II. And you probably weren't going to really change culture that much because all of those people were adults. But this was the first generation where you get a large youth contingent where you can say to yourself, right, I want to shape America. I want to shape the future. I want to decide what the culture is. And there is essentially a culture war to push for a new vision of what culture should be, what politics should be, what the youth should be. Even concepts like being a teenager were created around this time. Before that, you were just a youth, and then you went and worked on a farm at the age of 14, and then you were a bloke, you were a man. There was no concept of this middle period where you're getting excessive schooling, and there's no concept of having a teenage identity, which can be very, socially orientated, and you get into music and stuff like this. All of this stuff came around about this time. You see the rising up of the Beatles, the first real pop stars, the first idea of like international touring of a rock star, young women, teenage women going out and loving people. Even Elvis, I know he came before it, but it's leading into all this stuff. And then the political phenomenon that took place during this 1960s period are enormous, like the Heart and Cellar Act, which led to the immigration reform. That took place in the 60s. Psychedelics created the concept of drug taking, this open-mindedness being a virtue in and of itself, which is a very liberal position. This comes from the culture of psychedelics. You go out, you party, you take drugs. The experience of going to college, even now, I remember it, is you go in there and there's just drugs everywhere, and it's almost like biological warfare on your mind to transform you into an open-minded liberal, because these things actually have personality enhancing or changing effects. They make you more open when you take hard psychedelics. And so colleges become these places of almost like degeneracy in many ways, if you think about it. Of course, the sexual revolution takes place at the same time. Huge advancements in the emancipation of women took place. For example, Roe versus Wade, that is something that the Americans talk about to this day. This was 1973, at the end of the 60s. The boomers pushing this, the end of sexual discrimination in universities, even this enforcement of this idea that jobs primarily held by men, now you had to be equal and allow women into it. And of course, a huge part of this was the Civil Rights Act, which is also a huge part of the foundations of racial equality. You have Martin Luther King, you have all these marches that take place in order to end segregation and this idea that you're going to split up America based on race. A lot of this gets pushed forward and turned and codified into law in the 1960s. And the experience of this for boomers was an exhilarating feeling because they felt like they were young revolutionaries. And if you think about what it was like when you were young, this is a long time ago for me, but you young Zoomers, perhaps if you're listening, there's that feeling that you want to revolt, you want to change things, you want to feel that you can take action and have impact. And of course, the boomers felt that, and they were going out and having lots of free sex because, the sexual revolution was happening. They were taking loads of drugs, going to all these concerts. There was all this cool music coming out, and they felt like something was changing. They felt the energy enhancing, and all these high-minded, lofty ideals that a young person would have, some of them were getting put into practice. It felt like they were crafting the world in accordance with their ideals, and they were winning. And so as a consequence, the boomers have this sort of naive optimism. And by 1975, when a lot of them were starting to get older, they had completely, radically transformed all of society from the ground up. They had been through a Nietzschean reevaluation of all values. They had put many things into legislation and law, and they had this huge corpus of new music, like Led Zeppelin and all this stuff, that they could blare and play. They had created rock, so they had the soundtrack to the revolution all put in place. The Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, it was all there. And so throughout the 70s and 80s, these children of the revolution ascended higher and higher into positions of power and became the wealthiest generation in the world right now. And people like Steve Jobs, for example, get involved in things like Apple, and these are all boomers. And they install and enforce and deepen their values in the infrastructure and institutions that we live underneath. And each generation that would come after them would learn all of this stuff, would be saturated in boomer culture. You would see in the 80s and the 90s iterations on rock and roll, but they were fundamentally taking a boomer music form and, you know, giving their 1980s glam rock spin on it or giving their 1990s grunge spin on it, but it was the boomer music that was put into place there. The boomer revolution was successful. It got codified and enforced as moral law, and now we receive it as our culture, our cultural values, and the infrastructure of taboos that come along with this. So when you see people get threatened with prison for hate speech because they transgressed against civil rights concepts and how to deal with other races, or they offended the sensibilities of, you know, the sexual revolution or something like this, understand that this is a triumph of this reevaluation of values that the boomers went through. The boomers transformed culture. They went through a revolution in the 1960s, and they have now turned it into mainstream culture, and they have the power of the state to enforce this. And so this really sets the stage for what these statistics are telling us, because every generation since the boomers has been essentially an Olympian athlete, taking the torch off the boomers and carrying forward this 1960s Nietzschean reevaluation of all values and becoming more civil rights and more sexual revolution. This is what has happened. The boomers began this, but it was only about 40% of the youth that went through this chaotic revolution. It was not a majority situation. It was, in some sense, a minority, although quite a large one. Now, interestingly, the Zoomer shift that you're seeing now is the same size. The Zoomer shift that you're seeing is not the majority. As you'll know, you look at the Zoomers, there's a lot of Zoomers that are very, shall we say, hard left. But it seems like the quantity of them going to this extreme right perspective is about 40% as well. Now, the boomers did this. They had the moral reevaluation in the youth, and then they went into society and they probably became a little bit more conservative as they got older, and they did hold on to a lot of their sensibilities and all this. And then the Gen Xers come, and they have Kurt Cobain, and they actually take it forward a little bit more. They become more liberal, they become a better expression of these values. They might even begin to critique the boomers for never really carrying the revolution to its logical conclusion. And then we come. Us millennials come, and my God, we're tough guys, we're hardcore, we're determined to prove that we're the best, we're the most civil rights, we're the most 1960s, we're the most Nietzschean of all the people. So what we do is we become the most atheist, we become the most left-wing, we bring into fruition the woke movement, the fulfillment of the boomer prophecy. They are like our Moses, we are like their Joshua. And we go and we force it, we make it happen, and we look at Western civilization as Jericho that we must run around and eviscerate and destroy and pull down its walls so we can bring the pride flag, so we can bring the woke revolution, so we can have this total transformation, so we can grab the cross and cast it out into the desert, the abyss. While we say, let the dead bury the dead, we will now progress. We were the most sexually liberal generation that has ever probably existed in human history, for all we know. And us millennials, once we had proven that we were the real deal, the most serious crusaders in this great epic project to transform the whole world in the image of the boomers, we took this torch with its flaming value system on top of it, the 1960s revolution, and we handed it down to our Zoomer younger siblings, the little Zoomers, our little buddies, and we said, it's now your turn. Go and become more hardcore than us. Go and all become transsexuals. You should all be gay. You should all be LGBT. You should all be completely multicultural. You should fulfill these ideals in their maximum extent, because we've blasted all restrictions. We've dissolved all boundaries and all borders. It is completely up to you. And when we handed it and put it in their hands, they looked back at us with the fire flickering in their face. So when you see people in modern England, for example, get threatened with prison for hate speech, being told they're politically incorrect or racist, and they don't align with our values, which is something you hear an awful lot. What you're seeing there is the long forgotten boomer values turning into sacrosanct laws. The conversation is no longer this open, free discussion about, are these values correct? It's this idea that these are our values, and if you go against these, you're a bad person. You need to be cancelled. You need to be destroyed. You need to be eviscerated. And the reason why this has happened is because these values have been passed through the generations like a torch. The boomers handed them down to Gen X, and Gen X might have done their spin on it. They might have been grunge guys, but Kurt Cobain was ultimately very liberal. The Gen Xers go further with civil rights, further with boomerism. Kurt Cobain moves on from psychedelics and takes heroin. The liberalism goes more extreme. You see the rise actually of hard political correctness and the writings about, Judith Butler and stuff like this. It all comes in the 1990s. And then us millennials come next. The torch is passed to us, and we're serious. We're not joking around. We're going to do this stuff hard. And so we are the most sexually liberal. We take the craziest amount of drugs. We create all these different versions of drugs. Drugs culture becomes basically mainstream. We develop the woke movement. We become the most atheist, which we'll get into later. And we really take this stuff to its final conclusion. And this is the milieu that the Zoomers grow up in. And they say to themselves, what the fuck is going on here? These guys are crazy. But us millennials, we're not really aware of what we're doing. Neither are the Gen Xers or the boomers. Everybody just assumes that this is reality because all the older people have died off by now. And so us millennials hand the torch that has been passed from the boomers to the Gen Xers to us of these civil rights values, of the boomer world order. We hand this torch down to the Zoomers, and they look back at us and they say, wait a second, I love Kanye West. We listen to Nick Fuentes. We're listening to Andrew Tate. We're trying to break all these values. We don't care about anything you care about. Everything you care about is horrible, uncool, and old. It's destroying our world, so we will destroy it by taking all of the things you call taboo and turning them on their heads, making them values of ours. We're going to say civil rights sucks. We're going to say that we want to be nationalist. We want to be right-wing. We want to close off and restrict sexual morality. We want to say feminism sucks. We don't like any of this stuff anymore. Those things that you say are sacred, we say they are profane. And we have a value system that is different. This is the revolution taking place in the youth. And the Zoomers want to have a reevaluation of our values of their own. They want to reassess what these boomer values that they're told must be treated as sacred even are. Are we allowed to question them, or do we go to prison? Are you putting your children in prison? What the hell is going on there? But some people might hear all this and say, it's politics slop. This is, a passing trend, a fad. There's no depth to this. I don't really believe it. Okay, maybe there's some statistics about, the people in the colleges going hard right, specifically in the younger generations. But that's just, Charlie Kirk or Republicans or American politics or something like this. Fair enough. But where things get even more fascinating for me is seeing that these trends are getting mirrored in the religious statistics. The story with religion is also going through a revolution, and the religious problem is bigger and has been lasting longer and having a larger effect for a longer period of time. The boomers have been the last 50 years or so. The death of God question has been over a century, and the gradual trend has always been the youth believe less. Atheism has been snowballing and gradually gathering more momentum, but it seems like the Zoomers are bringing that to an end. Nietzsche, through Zarathustra, announced in the 1880s that God is dead and we have killed him. If you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the major premise at the start is that this great figure in the sky has been killed, and most people are unaware of this. At the beginning of the book, Zarathustra is hanging out in his mountain, but he becomes so full of power he decides to bring his wisdom down into the world. He first meets a hermit who convinces him not to go into the world and instead hang around in the forest, hanging out with God and the hermit. Zarathustra mutters to himself, does this guy not know that God is dead? Zarathustra continues down into the village and makes all these pronouncements and says, we've got this big problem. The sky is hollow. There is no value system for us to attach ourselves. We are in a very serious position. God has died. The sky is empty. Atheism looms over us like a dark cloud of pain. We need the Superman as some sort of vector and reevaluation, to some sort of aim for us to put in our heads to fill up this empty hole. And all the villagers laugh at him. They don't know what he's talking about. Zarathustra is early to the problem. But you might not live like this. You are not someone in the 19th century. A European back then probably wouldn't have understood what Nietzsche's talking about. But you look around yourself as a Zoomer, or a Zillennial, or a Millennial. Are there any boomers who watch me? Regardless, you look around your society and you live in the post-God world. The woke movement was the apex of getting God out of society, getting that Christian fascist in the sky to get out of here. And the progress of the 20th century was a gradual replacing of God and eradication of Christianity out of institutions. But for us younger people, there's an astounding bit of information in the statistics that show us that the idea that God has been long defeated, that he was killed in the 1960s by the boomers, that the communists in Russia got rid of him in the Eastern world, that is actually not what bears out in the stats. God was kind of kicking till very, very recently. In fact, as recently as 5 years ago. The statistics show that each generation has been progressively more atheist than the last one over the course of the last century. The boomers were more atheist than their parents. The Gen Xers, again, more atheist than the boomers. And us millennials were the most atheist. We were the apex of atheism. We maxed it out. We brought out the woke movement. Now, when you hear something like the death of God, you think that when Nietzsche announced it, that was it. God was dead. But instead, it took a while for this revelation to take place. Now, you might say to yourself, it happened, maybe 50 years ago or 40 years ago or during the Soviet Union or something like this. But the stats show us that the moment God's death became final and atheism became triumphant was around about 2018. Even in the year 2000, Christian belief was still a majority position in, for example, the UK. Now, there is one caveat. You could say church attendance is a better measure of this, and in fairness, church attendance has been abysmal for most of the 20th century, so maybe this is all just covering, this is all just nonsense. That is fair, that is true. Church attendance is like at 5% or something like this. Even in America, which is still very Christian, church attendance is barely struggling to get over 20%, 15%. So there is that other stat. If we're going to be clear and think clearly here, the actual attendance stats, what people do is an awful lot more important than what they say. But nonetheless, if we're going to go off declared beliefs, people in the UK were still declaring in a majority position to be believing Christians. This was still at 45% in the year 2000. The year 2000, 45%. The new atheists like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Hitchens, all these characters, when they show up, they were successful. They did capture an energetic wave. The atheists in early YouTube were a big phenomenon. They had a huge impact. And 15 years later, 2015, 2018, when the stats were done again, this majority position had swapped. In the year 2000, atheists were about a third of the population. 1 out of every 3 people you see is atheist. But almost 45%, basically half of people were declared Christians in the UK. By 2015, that had flipped around. 15 years later, that had flipped around. This was when I was a kiddo. So this was the triumph, the peaking of atheism was happening during the woke movement in the 2010s, in those last 10 years. That's when it happened. That's when God finally died. Finally, he was taken over by atheism. Finally, Christianity lost permanent belief grip on the West. That's when it happened. God gave out his last breath in the 2010s. But that's where the pivot point happened. Us millennials were the champions of the boomer ideas, the liberal world order, the civil rights ideals. We took it the furthest. We killed God. We were the most sexually abundant. And during this period, you see a lot of interesting celebrity archetypes that show you where this was. Take, for example, Russell Brand, who's now a based chud. He went anti-COVID, all these types of things. He's had a switch. He's now a Christian. Well, he, during the 2010s, used to make fun of evangelical Christians. He would bring them on the show and make fun of them for not liking homosexuals and things like this. Andrew Tate makes videos in 2017 or something saying how believing in God is dumb and he's an atheist because he's not stupid. Yet both of these people pivot during the 2020s and take hard pivots and seem to commit to these pivots. You might say, oh, maybe it's just opportunism, alternative media stuff, whatever you think. This happened. And what's important is that the statistics show that this didn't just happen with these guys. This happened in the people in general. There has been a trend shift, and it's more pronounced in the youth. Between the year 2021 and 2023, the youth began to say that they believe in a higher power at higher rates than they had before. They started going into the opposite direction that these enormous dying belief trends were indicating. Maybe a quarter of the people in 21 would say, I believe in a higher power. By 2023, that was 33% of people. Many articles began coming out during the 2020s saying that the Zoomers are radically breaking from their grandparents and their parents. They are less atheist than many of these. They're going in a different direction. This large, century-long cascading glacier trend of downward going belief, this atheist monster that was swallowing up the world, the youth are pivoting away from this, are taking a different direction. Now, this is something that everybody has seen subjectively. I remember during the 2010s in Ireland, the conquest that was taking place culturally was the eradication of Catholicism and the church from society. Gay marriage was brought in. Abortion rights were brought in. There was constant propagation of stories, and people were bringing up how the Catholic Church is full of abuse networks and various things like this. And the church was something we were casting off that was oppressing us. And there was actually a very positive and uplifting sentiment to this. Everybody around me used to always love it. They were talking to me about these huge civil rights advancements and how Ireland was progressing so much. And now in 2025 and during the 2020s, I've noticed nothing but people gradually shifting towards the right. People going back to things like their faith, people going into church, people saying to themselves, there's something really wrong with our country. A huge negative energy has switched into everything, and people are beginning to go back to things like religiosity in order to find consolidation and psychological stability. The tenor of the 2020s is actually really bleak and bitter, whereas the 2010s was uplifting and accelerating and progressive. Now it almost feels like a hangover, and maybe a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of people. It feels like the party is over, God's back, Daddy's come home, and he sees the mess you've made, and he's going to make you feel very bad for it. And a lot of the chuds, a lot of us chuds will say, the victory has been achieved. Christianity is back. We're going to mug all these atheists. Jordan Peterson won. This is what is happening. And to an extent, this is correct. Christianity is getting stronger, but this is not the correct or full story. The actual reality is even more nuanced and even more fascinating. Because this has one major caveat. Church attendance is not getting any better. Maybe there's a mild bump, but in the overall macro trend, it's not as big as a bump as the return to belief. People's belief is going much bigger. And their behavior is still not really into the church. And this is even worse because they are taking action in religious directions, just they're not doing it in things like temples and churches. They're doing it on their phones. Things like prayer apps going through the roof. Christian prayer apps getting used all the time. You probably see people like Russell Brand and all them try sell them and stuff. Because these prayer apps are becoming a big deal. Meditation apps, I'm sure you remember these. They've become huge as well. Anything related to a spirituality app seems to be becoming a big deal. And then on top of this, there are trends like spirituality, hashtags like this on TikTok that are getting enormous boosts, and people going on TikTok and exploring spiritual concepts. And when you start to look into this, you realize that it's not a Christian revival. It's more like a Protestant revival, only it's beyond Christianity. It's all forms of spirituality. It's not just we're going back to the Christian God. People are going back to the pagan gods. In fact, European paganism is going through an enormous fast revival right now. Growing and growing and growing every single year. People who explore the spirituality in a vague sense, the New Age stuff, like it is actually becoming big. Liberals and people who are lefty, who you might think is like hard atheists, even they're swinging to a sort of quasi-spiritual psychology thing, you know? This is the swing. It's techno-driven. The way we can see this is because it's happening through the phone. And the way people are interfacing with this is through the phone, specifically in the youth. The youth are going back to God, but through their phone. They don't trust boomer institutions like the church. They don't trust boomer institutions like psychotherapists. The reason why they're going back to the church, perhaps, or going back to God, or going back to spirituality is because their minds are destroyed. They're neurotic. They're not conscientious. They got locked in their house. Their brains, they're a very, very mentally ill generation. They're very, very sad and broken. And so what they're doing is they're trying to find a solution in the only way they know how, which is to go and ask the internet. And they're finding people like me, influencers, digital priests who tell them things. People like Jordan Peterson, people like Russell Brand, who explain to them how to live their lives. Nick Fuentes, Andrew Tate, these type of characters. Or like the litany, the thousands of other people into Buddhism or meditation and all these type of things. People showing people ways to live. And so people go into all these reality tunnels through TikTok. Billions of people exploring all this and interfacing with a spirituality. So what's getting rejected and what's getting affirmed is very specific. People are not affirming, Orthodox Christianity or Catholic Christianity or Protestant Christianity or my version of paganism or this type, or Nietzscheanism or something like this. It's everything all at once. And the negation is in the dead, sterile, lifeless universe of atheism. This idea that there is no soul in reality. That life is not animated and full of a soul. There's no logos in reality. Doesn't matter how you explore it, but that seems to be the coefficient. People want to believe. They want to believe that there is something out there bigger than us. That seems to be the trend shift. They're not going to church, not going back to that. And they're not defining this, but they're going towards this general abstract idea, reaching out for God again. And their phone is the way they do it. Now think about that. Think about what this shows us about the future. This is very interesting. The phones are making the Zoomers mentally ill. They're making them neurotic. They're changing their personality, making them less conscientious, less able to take action in the world. Meanwhile, the world around them is going through political problems where they are getting screwed in every possible level. Their money is getting inflated out of their hands. They're becoming politically cynical and radicalized as a consequence. They're going online to various influencers who are explaining reality to them, and they are binding to these people. And then on top of this, because of all this anguish about the state of things politically, and the anguish in their own soul about how their dopamine receptors are all fried, they are then reaching out for a belief system, a structure, through the phone, and interfacing with technology. It is the age of Aquarius. Carl Jung was right. His prediction that the Aquarian age would come after the Piscean age, and our experience of the conscience would be related to the Aquarian technological man. It seems like that's the way it's going. We want to come up with definitions for this. We want to try grasp this, but it's actually way weirder than we might think. The phone is entering into our heads, changing our personalities, changing how we act, and also changing how we believe and see and perceive reality, and connecting us all together in this collective universal conscience. The phone is this portal into this very bizarre world, and the people, the Zoomers, who are most influenced by the phone are literally going polar opposite to their boomer grandparents, completely inverting their value system because of the meme systems that are out there. So the question, the predicate at the head of this little video is, are these trends real? Are they passing fads, or is there weight underneath them? And I believe, because of all of this evidence, that this is going to be permanent. We are going to see significant changes over the next 50 years because the boomers are going to gradually fade out of existence. All of these institutions that construct our world are boomer institutions, therapy, maybe even church to an extent. And the way an awful lot of reality is done by the boomers, The Zoomers are coming in with these radical new technological systems, this radical new conscience, this new value system. They are much less stable, much more angst-driven, much more worried about things, and they're not really getting good answers for it. There are incredible questions about the future that open up here. What does it mean that technology is forming a part of our conscience? It's influencing how we see reality itself, changing our beliefs in God, religion, and politics, changing our personality and our psychology. How does this amplify when we look at how the phone had its effect and then add on top of it the thinking machine that is AI? You're already seeing people say stuff like, oh yeah, I've got AI boyfriends. You're seeing a lot of girls do this. They're going on to subreddits and saying that they got an AI boyfriend, or guys saying that they're having these spiritual experiences, like Mike Israetel saying this stuff about AI. What does this mean? What does it mean that this conscience has arrived? Through technology, through the phone, through the machine, voices are now going to come back and influence our minds more. This is what the Zoomers and the Gen Alpha are going to be. The test tube babies, the guinea pigs in this mass experiment, creating the new man, the future man, where information moves at rapid speed. So the next 20 years are going to be a lot of fun, my friends. Things are going to get crazy out there. The thinking machines are going to come, and already our personalities are getting morphed by technology. How crazy is it going to be? What's going to happen when the boomers bow out of society and hand over the world to the youth? Now, what I'd like to do in my next video is explore the gravity of these values, because the Zoomers are shifting to the right. They're going back to God. But how do we come up with an objective way to assess if these values are real or true, or something we can say to ourselves, all right, these chud values, are they the right direction for us to go? And lo and behold, I was looking into some neuroscientific studies, and I discovered that you can use magnets to influence people's brain chemistry and adjust their moral beliefs. There is a neurology to morality, and it's way weirder than you might think. So that's what's going to be next. I'll see you soon. Stay juicy. Bye-bye.